Good evening. My name is Cynthia Peabody. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Science and Religion. Welcome to our final seminar in our spring seminar series. And it's a beautiful evening, and I'm glad you all found your way here. It's going to be exciting. I wanted to let everyone know that next year, the Center for the Study of Science and Religion is going to try something a little new. And that is we're going to devote our entire seminar series, both fall and spring, to bioethics and religion. We're going to that's a huge topic, so I don't think we can bore you in any way. But the entire year we'll be looking at different aspects of the intricacies between bioethics and religion. If any of you know of a speaker that you would like to present on a topic that falls within that area, please, by all means, let me know. I actually brought business cards today, and I'd be happy to give you one, and you can email me. And if you'd like to be part of the planning process, we would welcome that. This evening, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Joe Loizzo. He is the founder of the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Science, and we also have cards that we would like you to see that tells you about the intensive training that you can get at the Nalanda Institute in mindfulness and contemplative sciences. It's exciting. It's very exciting. I've recently just been getting over an addiction to the television series The Wire. I adored that show for reasons I don't understand. But late at night, about 2 a.m., when I would finish a long session of way too many episodes at once, I would think about how the police had these big bulletin boards, and they would put up all of their suspects and their clues on these big bulletin boards so they could look at them. And I used to think, I would love to take my whole brain and all that tangled mess and throw it up on a bulletin board like that, and then take my heart and throw it up on another bulletin board, and then use push pins and string and make sense of all of it. And that would be so easy. And of course, I knew that that was all magical thinking, but perhaps not as magical as I thought. I've recently started looking at Joe's book, Sustainable Happiness, and he has a way to understand where the mind, the heart, the soul, and everybody around us comes together. That's what we can learn at the Nalanda Institute, and that's certainly what we can learn from his book, Sustainable Happiness. I just wanted to read one part from Sustainable Happiness that speaks to me, and I think will speak to all of you, and get us ready to listen to Joe speak to us this evening. I've written Sustainable Happiness as a crash course of sorts, meant to introduce a broader audience to what I believe may be humanity's most complete and systematic approach to finding optimal health and lasting happiness in complex lives like ours. It makes accessible the healing insights, skills, and strategies I use to help individuals navigate cataclysmic change in the awareness that the global solutions we need today must begin and end with solutions on the human scale, one mind, one heart, one life at a time. With that profound statement that we could all think about for a very long time, I would like to introduce Dr. Joe Loizzo.
so much, Cynthia. Can people hear okay? So it's my honor to be here. I love this center, and when I was doing some graduate studies in the religion department with Bob Thurman, Bob Pollock and I did a couple of courses together, which were really fun, and I think certainly we share that, whether it's a schizophrenic or an integrative interest. It I guess depends on the day. Trying to pull together the big picture questions that aren't often asked in many disciplines, right? But they're simple questions in a way, the kind of questions kids ask. What are we here for? What's happiness, and why? Where do we go, and where do we come from, and that kind of thing. So I think that I'm going to really tell you a story today that grows out of my sort of that era of my life, and sort of weaves in some things that have been happening since then, which were really back in the 90s in neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a psychiatrist by training and a Buddhologist, but I did, I sort of have really tried to delve as much as possible in terms of understanding the neuroscience of meditation, which I think has enormous impact for us. And I'll try to put that in light of the larger, what I see as the larger transition that we as humanity and as a planet are in right now. I know that's big, but I'll try to sort of make the case. So I'm going to talk to you about three things. Talk about where we come from, the modern rift between science and religion. Why do we have a Center for the Study of Science and Religion? Because they seem to be moving farther and farther apart every day. And some of us feel that they need to be moving closer together and working together. We need both ethics and contemplation on the one hand, and knowledge and technology on the other. So I'll talk about the modern rift between science and religion. I'll talk about the convergence of brain science and meditation research, which is really a fascinating development that's just happened really in the last few decades, and really almost in the last few years. It's just really come of age in the last few years. It's very, very exciting for somebody like me who's been thinking about, angsting about this, predicament of Western culture for my whole life, for probably very personal reasons. Really exciting what's happening, and some of my colleagues like Richie Davidson and John Kabat-Zinn and so on, been really making changes that will potentially impact us all. Then I'm going to talk about the new compassion research, specifically as it relates to the world religions, and the religion, of course, that I know the most about at this point in my life is the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And I think personally, historically, I agree with Arnold Toynbee, who said that one of the big events of this millennia will be the coming together of the Asian Buddhist and Western Christian or Calvinist capitalist cultures in the world, and I'll try to explain why I think that is. How Buddhism is a uniquely interesting sort of bridge religion or missing link religion that helps to heal the rift between science and religion. And I think that that's actually what's been happening in recent years. So I've got my sort of handy-dandy, beautiful picture of the Buddha, right? The medicine Buddha. I got my handy-dandy slideshow here. I'm not sure how relevant it's going to be. Some of it is going to be really quite relevant and interesting. But at least for the beginning part, we're going to have to be. I'll take you through a tour of Nalanda University, but not until later. Why don't we stick? Let me just give you the background, and we'll just have the Buddha watching over us for a bit as I give you some historical background. So when we talk about the rift between science and religion, how did it happen? And I don't know that anybody really knows the answer to that, but this is the best story that I've been able to come to over the years of trying to figure this out. If you look at our ancient, we consider ourselves Western, And actually, even the notion of being Western is a fairly modern notion and a kind of constructed notion in a certain way. But probably it starts from the Greeks. Somehow we seem to agree that the Greeks and the Romans had some major differences with the Persians and the Syrians and so on and so forth. But interestingly enough, if you look at Greek culture, Roman culture, but certainly the Greek scientific and philosophical traditions, this whole idea of sort of a split between science and religion really wasn't there at all. Socrates, all of them were fascinated by all these big questions. Of course, there were some people who specialized in some areas of knowledge and others who were more interested in others. So I like to say that in Greek culture, as in Indian culture, and I would, I believe Chinese culture as well, although, I'm not prepared to really, defend that. There were two paradigms of science extant in the ancient world. One was what you might call, what we normally call science, physical science, math, physics, mechanics, medicine, these kinds of things. Another was what I have come to call contemplative science or inner science. The closer paradigm to that is sort of yoga, gymnosophism, the philosophical tradition of Socrates and Plato, for example. Really looking within, trying to find the answers to life by looking within and understanding our own minds and how they relate to the larger universe. At a certain point, the Catholic Church came along trying to save the Roman Empire, right, from falling apart. And there was a need for uniformity, I think, in my view, sort of because the Mediterranean was a tough neighborhood, very hard to defend, many sort of different languages and cultures. And what happened was that there was a suppression of the physical science traditions and a sort of dominance, an orthodoxy of contemplative science. So for most of the medieval era, Plato and his works through the Neoplatonics were well known. The contemplative tradition really was the main scientific tradition, and even medicine was integrated within that to some extent, what we now think of as humoral medicine. And then sort of the Arabs came along. The Arabs came along and, because of their, conquest through India, through all the way to sort of the Silk Road, they really created a superhighway, an information superhighway between the great ancient river valley civilizations and brought many of, if you studied Joseph Needham's work, brought many of the ancient inventions from China, from India to the West, things like the Arabic numerals, which of course were Sanskrit numerals, basic chemistry inventions, fore and after rigging. I mean, he lists 23 of them. But with them, they integrated them into rediscovery of Aristotle as well as Plato. And so that stimulated us in Europe to start thinking, because there was, Spain and Sicily were occupied by Arabs, and there was dialogue, and texts were translated. And so people started discovering the physical science side that wasn't there. And they also started discovering ancient contemplative science practices. Now, the church really had an interesting response to this. As I like to say, a Cardinal Fang, right, in the Inquisition, it was quite interesting that Galileo, who was messing around with the cannonballs and trying to, found, physical science based on Aristotle, was spared when he went before the Inquisition. But Giordano Bruno, who was looking inward and trying to understand the nature of the mind using sort of non-Christian, non-theistic understandings based on the Hermetic tradition, was fried, okay? So, this to me led to an imbalance. And the way I understand that is that there's a kind of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. So I think the church was willing to cede the outer physical reality, and because they needed people who made cannonballs, because they were having their own problems getting invaded by people left and right, but also they didn't care that much, really. They didn't feel it was a threat to them to cede the realm of physical science to these new thinkers, this new science. But when it came to spiritual science or psychological science, they were quite repressive. So I think what happened is then you developed a new form of science that was leaning toward the mathematical, physical side and did not have the contemplative side. And so what we're left with is a very ancient contemplative tradition that was repressed, and a progressive modern scientific tradition that's totally split from it. And these two are like oil and water because they're basically, they see each other as hostile intellectual or cultural engines. Okay? They're at war. So what do we do about that? I mean, you know, I think there's sort of serious issues that actually affect us. I mean, this is a big intellectual story, blah, blah, blah. But how does this actually affect us, you know, in everyday life is that our notion of, you know, science, our notion of the sort of modern materialist science that we were taught, like social Darwinism, for example, or the notion of scarcity at the root of modern, you know, free market economics, really developed a kind of pop psychology that said, you know, greed is good, only, you know, brute survival, you know, the sort of the might makes right, knowledge is power, these kinds of sort of modern messages, and the secular world has drifted in that direction. So what happens, and I think in that sense, that's the glitch we're all covered in. Our religious cultures, we go to Sunday school, it's increasingly irrelevant to what's happening in our everyday lives. What's happening in our everyday lives is increasingly divorced from any kind of ethos or any kind of contemplative experience. And so enter now the sort of discovery of meditation, the rediscovery of contemplation and ethics in the West. So this started, say, in the 80s with Herb Benson. I was in his lab for a while, and we went to visit John Kabat-Zinn doing his pain clinic stuff. And people began to show that stress, which had been sort of recently understood in the 50s, could be reversed or contained through meditation. You know, we then started to look at the psychological factors of stress, that it isn't just, stress isn't just a biological process. 80% or so of stress, you know, there's a huge variability in terms of what stresses people out, and 80% of that or more is internal. It lies in how we appraise, how we emotionally respond to, and how we behaviorally deal with stressful situations. And of course, then we started looking at type A personality, right? And researchers like Larry Sherwitz and others, Redford Williams, started breaking down and discovering that the things that were supposedly good for us, that look out for number one, you know, were actually killing us. Okay, so they did studies on, for example, Redford Williams did his famous studies on hostility, showing that you know, people, so medical students were more hostile than other medical students, prospectively studied over you know, 15, 20-year period, get sicker from all causes more, you know, more frequently, die earlier, and recover less quickly. You know, other studies on sort of average general populations were also found. So he wrote his book, Hostility Kills, a fair amount of research showing that hostility or anger or frustration really is actually poisonous to us. Another sort of interesting, and talking about the lookout for number one research paradigm or sort of cultural paradigm of the modern West, Larry Sherwitz did a very elegant study on he looked at a multi-center trial out of the National Institute of Health, which involved unstructured studies, unstructured interviews. And he went back over those unstructured interviews, and he coded the interviews based, he'd maybe listening to the Beatles, he coded each of the interviews based on how many times people said, I, me, or mine per phrase. And those people that said I, me, or mine more often, he called them highly self-involved, and those people who said I, me, or mine less often were less self-involved. Well, the highly self-involved people were more likely to get heart disease, a statistically significant finding. Within that group of heart disease patients, the more self-involved people were more likely to get heart attacks. And within the heart attack group, the more self-involved people were more likely to die of those heart attacks. And interestingly enough, in that in the heart attack group, he was also studying depression, he was studying smoking, cholesterol, all these variables were taken. And self-involvement in that study, in that sort of last cohort, turned out to be a better predictor, a higher risk factor for a fatal heart attack than smoking, high cholesterol, or depression, okay? And this is something that no modern Western scientist would ever, or physician would ever think to be true. Why? Because our whole modern framework has basically said all that stuff that we were taught in Sunday school, be nice to other people, be selfless, be loving, be kind, is all garbage. What reality is really about is struggle for survival, survival of the fittest. Of course, since then, we've discovered social evolution. So thanks to Hamilton and Hamilton's formula for altruism, for kin-directed altruism, we've discovered that actually evolution, that genes have a reason to help us become altruistic because altruists can protect each other. And so there's a selective effect that he created a very elegant mathematical formula and started a whole new field of sociobiology and a whole sort of new understanding of evolution. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, in other parts of the research world, neuroscience started, positive psychology and neuroscience started discovering the importance of mindfulness, right? So, some very elegant work done by my colleague Richie Davidson, for example, with a bunch of 8 Tibetan lamas, showed that these lamas, so the big discovery, Eric Kandel up at the medical school got the Nobel Prize in 2000 for discovering that mollusks, the neurons of mollusks, learn. So if environmental change occurs, the mollusk has to behave differently to adapt to it, and eventually their nerve cells are altered, their genes are transcribed differently, and the structure of the nerve cells changes, and so this develops this whole notion of neuroplasticity, and totally, with quite a bit of struggle and conflict over the course of several decades, the sort of religion of neuroscience that we're all hardwired, our brains are hardwired, has completely turned around, and we now understand that neural tissue is fundamentally plastic. So then enter Richie Davidson and his Tibetan monks, okay? And he does some very elegant studies using EEG and MRI, and what he finds is that these monks have an interesting capacity to, at will, generate very high frequency gamma wave activity over their brains. And that activity is thought to be, fortunately, he showed these people could do so with an intensity and a duration that was orders of magnitude more than what had been previously found in the literature. So that was interesting. But then even more interesting was the fact that that signature of high frequency gamma activity is often associated with neuroplasticity. And the idea really that he put forth in some of his early studies was that these monks were really able to actually stimulate their capacity for neuroplasticity and hence enhance the process of learning and change at the brain level. And other studies have, by his colleagues and his team and other teams have shown that meditators' brains are thicker, the cortex of brains are thicker. Lutz et al. In 2004 and Sarah Lazar in 2006 did some very elegant studies showing that a variety of different meditative techniques thickens different regions of cortex. There's some very elegant studies that show that meditators overall are spared the cognitive decline that is otherwise the normal fate of us human beings. Okay, that actually the brains of meditators stay where they were when they were 35, more or less, whereas the rest of us go downhill. So start meditating if you want to save your brain power, guys. So mindfulness suddenly went from being a very marginal, weird thing that people were studying because they were interested in spirituality, basically, and they felt there was some spiritual healing must have some place, to being right on the center of the map of contemporary neuroscience. Okay, that happened within a number of years, and we even now have a field that was dubbed by Richie Davidson contemplative neuroscience. I never imagined that there would be, and he's gotten paper. I mean, that paper was the first paper on meditation to be published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And since then, there have been dozens. So meditation really has sort of come back. And alongside meditation, now we have affective neuroscience. So while our biology is telling us we're all systems, we're social systems, our evolutionary theory is telling us social cooperation may be as or more important than competition. And our neuroscientists start to discover that emotions are playing into the mix. And they discover not only that they validate that negative emotions are not so good for our health, but they start to discover that positive emotions, and guess what? Love and compassion and joy and equanimity, okay, are really good for us, okay? They make us happy. They make us feel we have a meaningful life. They make us heal quicker, be more resilient from trauma or injury. And they do really, they're remarkable medicine, okay? So you have all of these fields coming together now. You know, mindfulness, you could think, well, maybe mindfulness and the Enlightenment kind of go together, right? You're kind of calm, you're just focused, you're paying attention. But when you start dealing with compassion, you're dealing with something that really did not play much of a role in the Enlightenment world. And you're dealing with something that really was and is at the center of our religious traditions. And so this is really sort of reintroducing religious ethics and contemplation back into the mainstream of science so that these are now extremely not only relevant but hot research areas. I went to a recent study, how am I doing time-wise? I went to a recent conference at Denver, the first international conference on contemplative studies, and everybody was there. It was like Old Home Week, you know, John Kabat-Zinn and Richie Davidson and Sharon Salzberg and, you know, you name it, people that have been laboring in isolation against the system for decades and decades and decades, thinking that nothing would ever change. And then sort of this was like the Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You know, everybody comes together. And the remarkable thing to me was I went there expecting, you know, more and more, you know, mindfulness, and more mindfulness, because, you know, mindfulness has gone from, it's exploded as a research area. In 1985, there were 3 studies on mindfulness. In 2012, there were 1,400. Okay, but guess what? I didn't find mindfulness. I found a whole group of very exciting new research projects on compassion. Okay, and so what people were discovering was that now the whole affective neuroscience movement is coming together with this compassion training traditions. Okay, so this is really what I want to talk to you about and what excites me a lot, right? Because this isn't just historically interesting and maybe like a good trend. This starts to get really practical because, you know, living in the everyday world, especially the world we live in, it actually is pretty hard to stay mindful, right? There's so many things, overload, information overload, stresses and strains, competition, you name it. And the ancient traditions that I will tell you about really believe that the way for us to have some peace of mind in the everyday world, if we weren't going to drop out and be professional religious people and meditate for the rest of our lives, the right tool for the job to have some peace and adjust in a positive way to our everyday lives was to develop love and compassion, okay? And so I was really excited to see that a bunch of these labs, the lab at Stanford, the CARE lab, the Emory lab, and this group from the Max Planck Institute were doing very solid and interesting research on compassion. And so now I think I can actually start to use some of these things so it's not just me blabbing. We'll come back to this, because this is sort of an inverted talk. I'm getting to the end first, and then I'm going back to the beginning. Don't worry, we'll do this. I mean, we'll touch on it anyway. We're not going to do it. Okay, I just want to get to We'll see some pretty things on the way, right? You have to say that at least, right? Isn't this kind of fun? All right. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about, okay, neural effects of mindfulness. It builds prefrontal attention networks. Okay, so it allows us to pay better attention and to use the new part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, to regulate our whole older brain, all the sort of archaic parts of our brain that could get us in trouble, especially meaning the amygdala, okay? But not exclusively the amygdala, the sympathetic nervous system, the whole hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the stress response engine. So the prefrontal cortex helps to tone that down. It enhances particularly left prefrontal activity. So here's an interesting fact that the right and left brains they're not the same. There's a laterality when it comes to their problem-solving style or their emotional processing, their information processing style. The right brain is more geared to traumatic emotion, distress, and avoidance. Okay, so I mean, it does many other things. I don't mean to give the right brain a bad name, but it does preferentially store and process negative emotions, and it's related more closely to the sympathetic nervous system, which is designed to sort of protect us, to get us into fight or flight when we're threatened. The left brain is more the sort of optimistic approach and opportunity-oriented part of our brain. Okay, it's a little bit more floating above things. It's more sort of, I don't want to say manic-y exactly, but it's sort of very optimistic. It's a little bit less grounded in the painful memories and realities of life, but it's more able to envision and so on and so forth. And so mindfulness enhances that, and as a result gives us greater distance from our emotional traumas and triggering. And that helps us improve emotional regulation. It also increases resilience, okay, so that if we have a trauma, we just recover more quickly. We're not so lost in it. Now, here's something really interesting. So this is, to go back to the study, this was also a study done in Richie Davidson's lab and then was replicated by 3 other labs. And that is that of course, they did the expert compassion meditators, which is interesting. But then more interesting to us as ordinary people is that they developed a 5-session compassion training program based on the Tibetan what's called the mind training tradition in Tibet. And what they found was that those people did not respond with as much negativity. So normally we have mirror neurons, right? So we have these neurons in our prefrontal cortex and in other parts like the fusiform gyrus and so on. And these allow us to read other people's facial expressions, and then they connect to the amygdala and other parts of the emotional brain, the limbic brain, and they call up the emotions that we think what we might be feeling if our face looked like that. Okay? So we're trying to call up a feeling that is kind of empathic or sympathetic sense of what's going on inside the other person's mind. The problem is, of course, we have what's called emotional contagion. Like somebody's feeling bad, we have a tendency to feel bad with them. And we remember all of our traumas, and this is part of the reason why people have, I would call sympathy fatigue. I don't think it's real compassion fatigue. But what really is fascinating about, and actually this is when I was a medical student, my wise professors said, take your empathy and park it at the door because it'll make you burn out. If you care about your patients, you'll get too involved, you'll make bad decisions, and you'll burn out, okay? And I knew they were wrong at the time. Although there may be a kernel of truth to it, is that if you don't know how to be skillfully compassionate, you can be triggered by other people's suffering. And so there is that kernel of truth. And what was fascinating about these studies is that they showed that after 5 sessions of training, these people had less of the contagion response, right? So they were less negatively triggered by other people's suffering. And instead, 3 positive things happened with the limbic system that didn't happen before. One is that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, part of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's right behind the third eye here, right in front of our head, was increasingly activated. And what that meant was that these people became ready to approach the suffering rather than avoid it. They became ready to spring into action. That part of our prefrontal cortex, along with the cingulate gyrus, the anterior cingulate gyrus, so to try to get us ready to respond effectively and deal with something. At the same time, they're building connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the insula, which is part of our frontal cortex that gives us like a window onto our whole nervous system, on our whole body. It's like our window inside. And so when we pay more attention, when there's connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the insula, our body is calmer, our organs are functioning in a more relaxed way. And so this was calming our nervous system. And then the last thing is that it also developed connectivity with the nucleus accumbens, which is in the hypothalamus and the ventral striatum, a sort of part of the lowest part of the limbic system, which is the early mammal brain. And the nucleus accumbens, very interestingly, is connected with reward. It's connected with pleasure and the experience of blissful internal reward. So what is happening is that these people who get compassion training are learning how to be prepared to help, how to calm their own minds, and to feel and enjoy the process of caring for another living being, right? This is a very, very powerful study because it shows that in such little time, compassion can go from being sort of a burnout, like don't give it, to being a very powerful adaptive reflex or response, okay? So, all right. And I don't think we need to go any further into that, but so this brings us back to the Nalanda tradition, and I think I have some time to discuss that. I mean, I'm not going to say anything about the next revolution because I'm going to stay where we are, but I'll just mention where the next horizon, I think, is going to come. The next horizon is going to come from what's called polyvagal theory and the importance of understanding the vagus nerve that really is the contrary, the thing that balances the fight or flight nervous system and specifically allows us to stay calm and heal and grow and learn. It supports most of this higher cortex. So the higher cortex stops working when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. When we have stress, we stop thinking, we stop negotiating. We're just like an inner dinosaur. Okay, we go back to the dinosaur era. Whereas the vagal nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system supports our ability to stay calm in the presence of others. And interestingly, what we've discovered is that mammals have a special branch of the vagus nerve called the smart vagus by one particular researcher, Stephen Porges, that we can consciously regulate. So it's a branch of the vagal nerve. This is what allows us to breathe consciously as well as breathe automatically, right? And that part of the vagal nerve allows us to influence the whole brainstem because it gives, if we can control our breath, we can control the nuclei of the vagal nerve, which are very sort of closely connected to several key activation centers, including the heart rate, giving feedback to the heart, putting on what's called the vagal brake on the heart rate and blood pressure. So, and the other interesting thing, just to give you a brief synopsis of this, is that to go back to the issue of religion, right? When we see a familiar face, our vagal nerve is stimulated, and it calms our whole system and gets us ready to socially engage with that person. When we hear a familiar voice, the same thing happens. Okay? The facial nerve, the auditory nerve have interneurons connecting them to the vagal nerve. So this whole system has been transformed. It used to be gill arches in fish, but in us mammals, it's all been transformed into a social gill system. It allows us to take in and swim in our social environment. But interestingly, if you think about religion, what do? You know, human images, prayers, you know, chanting, and that kind of thing. What that really, probably somehow does is affect the vagal nerve and allow us to stay socially calm and not freak out, okay? But to rather stay in our higher social capacity, to stay compassionate, because essentially we're recognizing kin as opposed to recognizing predators, okay? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Nalanda tradition now, if I can navigate my way back there. Why is this Nalanda tradition relevant to us? Well, other than the fact that as academics, we should be aware that Nalanda University was the first residential university in the world. And guess when it happened? Didn't happen at the time of the University of Bologna or the University of Paris or the University of Oxford. It happened in the 5th to 7th centuries. So like a millennia before those things were happening. Started in the 250. Why it was interesting is that it's a splinter. Of course, so look at Asian. Look at Eurasian history. So all cultures throughout history have had contemplative skills, right? We all have a shaman. We all have a medicine man. We all have a priest or rabbi or whatever minister. We all have experts. India was the first culture, or the culture in the Eurasian orbit, that was first to really believe that everybody needed to learn how to be a contemplative. Everybody needed to have access. There was really a sense of a freedom. There was a revolution for freedom that involved access to contemplative skills that happened in India around the time of the Buddha. And that's when the Upanishads happened and so on. And the civilization in general committed itself. That's why we have yoga centers on every corner, sort of when the churches are really in danger, unfortunately. Hopefully they'll start having yoga in the churches soon and then we'll be okay, or yoga and meditation in the churches. We have yoga, and mindfulness meditation becomes the dominant methodology. So of all forms of meditation, the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, basic meditation training. Why? Because, these traditions explicitly try to take the religion as much as possible out of these methodologies and make a science and art of these methodologies. And Buddhism especially, because the Buddha himself, critiqued creationism and believed in causality as the ultimate principle that should guide knowledge systems, including spiritual knowledge systems. So he believed every person had to solve the human condition on their own, and that we all had the capacity to do that if we understood the causality. And if we had the right tools to manipulate the causality of suffering and turn it into the causality of happiness, that we each could. And that's the Buddhist program, is to teach everybody. And Nalanda was a splinter of the main Buddhist group that focused not so much on just monks and nuns in the monasteries, but focused on teaching lay people. And the whole purpose of Nalanda was to take the tools that the Buddha had developed and the systems for people learning how to heal and find happiness and compassion, and make them available to mainstream institutions, intellectual disciplines, and out of this dialogue is part of where we get classical Hinduism with the Gita and the emphasis there on compassion and non-dualism and so on. So Nalanda was interesting because over the course of whatever it is, 1,000 years or so, it developed this scientific approach to teaching contemplation that was lay-oriented and oriented toward multiple disciplines. Brahmins taught there as well as Buddhists. Jains taught there. And what happened is that it is considered also to be the source, the alma mater of all four schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So the Tibetans and many other Asian cultures decided to import Buddhism from this university because it was a more open, progressive version of Indian culture and Buddhist culture. And it really was trying to present a form of science and civilization that was sustainable. And the essence of it is this teaching of love and compassion. That the tools, that if we want to have a mindful life and we're going to live in the lay world, we need to develop our love and compassion for all living beings, and we need to develop our altruism. Okay, so there were tools developed specifically for all of those that are more, I would call industrial strength tools than the tools that we're used to just from some basic mindfulness. The Tibetans loved this approach, and so they imported it. So there's these three versions of Buddhist, there's three sort of layers of Buddhist history. The first is the one we know about with the yellow saffron-robed monks in South Asia, and that's where mindfulness, the mindfulness teachings that we know of came from. Then there's the East Asian tradition, which we know through Zen, and we became familiar with after the war. Then finally, the Tibetan tradition was hidden in the mountains until the Chinese invaded Tibet. And the interesting thing about the Tibetan tradition is it's cumulative, right? So each of these traditions got Buddhism at a certain point along the way, but Buddhism, unlike some Western religious traditions or some other religious traditions, is cumulative. You can't, the schism isn't allowed, basically. So you have to incorporate other teachings, and, like science. If there's a useful paradigm, you incorporate it, okay? And so the Tibetan tradition incorporates the mindfulness practice that's related to the individual or personal healing, the universal vehicle, the compassion practice that's related to healing our social relations, and what's called the tantric process, the process vehicle, esoteric role modeling practice that's designed to develop altruism and creativity, some spiritual creativity to transform the culture. So I'm just going to briefly say, and the essence of the Tibetan tradition is a gradual path in which all three vehicles are practiced as one, right? So mindfulness, compassion training, role modeling, altruism, are all practiced as one practice. So it's a very comprehensive approach. At the Nalanda, we've done a 20-week program for women with breast cancer based on this approach. And we've had very good results in 2 studies showing that this increased their quality of life more than anything else out there. It also showed changes in AM cortisol and resting heart rate that showed physiological benefits, showed increase in emotional and functional domains, and also showed a decrease in traumatic avoidance. So that's really important because women who get cancer diagnosis or treatment end up really feeling a tremendous fear of recurrence. I'm doing a program over at Cornell right now at the breast center working with women who are living with that fear. And these techniques are really have been proven actually in our second study with underserved population in the Bronx, were found to be more effective than anything else at reducing traumatic avoidance after cancer, okay? So these techniques really work. And putting all 3 of those techniques together, basic mindfulness, compassion training, and using imagery and affirmation is a very powerful package that I think will be very important in our very highly sort of pressing world. Let me just see how we're doing time-wise. Oh, not too bad. Okay. So I'm just going to tell you now, I'm going to go a little bit sort of, far out and talk a little bit about the wheel of time. Because one of the interesting things about this tantric tradition of science, the esoteric or process-oriented tradition that's unique to Tibet, is very interesting for a variety of reasons. One, it uses art like this. These aesthetic images, they're beautiful, but they're designed as meditative guides or maps. The other is that it also uses the chakra system, the contemplative map of the nervous system. And in my view, there's elements of the way this model works that make it not only in some ways very prescient of modern neuroscience, but in my sense, actually in some sense, even preferable to modern neuroscience, in the sense that, have you ever tried to look at a map of the brain lately? It's just baffling. It's too complicated to really help us. Whereas these maps are designed for practice. So I'll give you a little sense. I'm going over some of this. So the brain, here's a picture of the brain. It's a heterarchy, right? That means that evolutionarily, they're basically 3 or 4 brains piled together into one super glom brain or super hybrid brain, okay? And this is part of the reason why when the inner dinosaur takes over our brain, the inner mammal and the inner primate and the inner human have to take a back seat. And it's the dinosaur that runs the show, okay? That's the Hulk factor or the Wolfman factor, okay? But basically, the idea here is that the vision of the new mindfulness research is that the prefrontal cortex is this part of our brain that's capable of reaching deep into all of these older brain regions, like the limbic system, and even through the vagal nerve into the brainstem, is able to integrate all of these older, perhaps more reactive or primitive parts of the nervous system into a higher, socially engaged, mindful, compassionate, truly civilized brain, okay? And we have that capacity through neuroplasticity and through the natural linkage potential that our brains offer us, because we have these many different layers of the brain. And I believe that this map of the yogic nervous system from the side really is mapping the same thing. This thing that's the central channel, the blue thing there, is really, that's really what we call the neural tube in the West. It's where the spinal cord developed, and these centers represent the different layers of the nervous system, of which in different models you see 4, sometimes 5, sometimes 7, sometimes 8. But the idea here is that an integrated nervous system is a nervous system where all the different levels of consciousness are talking to each other, and where they're all integrated with a kind of blissful openness. That's what that central channel represents. Okay, that's like the internal reward system where the nucleus accumbens. That's tapping us into our capacity to feel safe, warm, happy, open. So when we're in that part of our nervous system and we can override the stress reactive nervous system, we feel a sense of integration or wholeness. And that's what this map is really describing. And I put the two side by side just for the fun of it. It's not as wacky a thesis as you think when you realize that the distance between the cortex and these nerves down here, okay? The distance between 2 points in the nervous system at any time is really no more than 1 or 2 cells, right? So all of these are long, long neurons that come all the way from the brain all the way down here, okay? So you may think, well, this map over here is different because everything seems to be in the body and what's up in the brain, just what they call the 1,000-petaled lotus. I mean, the 100,000-petal lotus. That's what they call the brain. But the reality is that from my point of view, they're just mapping the same neurons where they synapse, okay, where the axon, the axon terminal plate of the axon is. Okay, so if you look at a nervous system from the axon end, that's where you're going to find it. The nervous system, the nerves that feed the heart, you're going to see the axon end of them here, even though the neural bodies might be in the brainstem. Okay, the neurons that contain motor responses are going to be up in the frontal cortex, but the terminal plate, the axon plates, are going to be all the way down here. So it's not as crazy as you think neuroanatomically. Not that that matters, but anyway. The other element that I want to point out is this notion of laterality, because it gives us a clue about what the chakra nervous system is. If you've ever seen the chakra system, you'll see it's like this. It has a central channel and then 2 side channels, and the side channels wrap around. And actually, the complexes are made when there's a wrapping around or a complexity of the side channels. And what that really overlaps with, in my view, is the balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, which are the basic sort of homeostasis regulators throughout the nervous system. Okay, and so if the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are in balance, then it's easier for us to tap in to find peace. And in fact, there is a laterality here, so that the vagal system is more pronounced on the left brain and the left side of the body, the sympathetic on the right brain and the right side of the body. Though interestingly, these squiggles represent the sort of somatic distribution. But interestingly, also there's an every hour or two, the phase shifts, right? So every hour or two, one side of the body is preferentially innervated by the vagal nervous system, and the other side is not, and then that shifts over the next hour. So there's a constant diurnal shifting of rhythms that going on within our system that I think is represented by this map, okay? And basically what this is saying, if you look at the other map as a map of vertical integration, that the essence of a highly evolved or functional brain is the integration of the higher capacity, of the lowest functions with the highest capacities, right? Is having all levels of the brain working together for the highest purpose, or in touch with the highest consciousness. This is really about lateral integration, having the tendencies at any level. You want to have a certain degree of calm and a certain degree of activation. You don't want to have too much calm, you don't want to have too much activation. So there needs to be balance at every level laterally as well as vertical integration in order for the nervous system to be healthy. So that's, I mean, I'm just trying to give you a little flavor for what I've learned in terms of understanding how wise and sophisticated some of these models are, even though they come from a long time ago. So I'm going to close with a few comments that are, again, perhaps a little more far out. Here's some references which we don't have to worry about. This describes our 4-year program in sustainable happiness, which we're also not going to worry about. And what we're going to go and talk about is the, okay, this is an interesting archetype called Bob Thurman likes to translate, you know, as you can see these fierce archetypes are sort of like signature of the Tibetan tradition. What they represent is the ferocity of the mind tamed by contemplation, right? The intensity of the mind, integrated and tamed by contemplation. The male and the female represent the subjective and objective, the feminine and masculine, solar and lunar energies. In this particular archetype is a very interesting archetype for all of us living on the planet Earth. Why? Because it was taught, this represents the ultimate integration of contemplative science within the Buddhist tradition, within the Nalanda tradition. And that specifically was an integration where all of the sciences, including physical sciences, and they have their own version of quantum physics, they have space particles and things like that, and life sciences, including an understanding of how all systems in the body and the environment are interconnected, and how all social lives are interconnected. And they integrated them and subordinated them to what they call pure science of contemplation. And that pure science is the science that teaches us how to use our instrument, our mind and body. And within that pure science, they have the belief that we always have access to this inner part of our nervous system that is blissfully open and plastic and transformable. And that by using that access, we can dematerialize all the reactive habits of stress and trauma. So we can do our own psychotherapy, right? Our intensive, deep psychotherapy, and tap into or build a neural network that is really tuned into the frequency of blissful openness and sort of optimal creativity and social engagement that sort of embodies or personifies an open, complex response to the universe. This tradition is interesting to us also specifically historically because it was taught, unlike many of these other traditions, where the sort of highest sort of practices were shrouded in secrecy, and you have to go to around the corner and dig holes and prove yourself. This was, they believe in this tradition that you can do away with the need for secrecy by relying on science, and that by explaining scientifically how contemplation works, you can make the most subtle and profound contemplative techniques accessible to everyone in a way that they will not misunderstand and misuse it. And their vision for the planet is that actually there's a prophecy that goes along with this. The prophecy is that the sciences of the contemplative sciences and the Kala Chakra tradition will stay hidden somewhere in a Central Asian kingdom called Shangri-La, or Shambhala is the original Sanskrit name, okay? And then just at the time when the East and the West are about to destroy the planet because of warring with each other, these secret agents that have been hidden in this contemplative science are going to come out of hiding, and they're going to spread this contemplative science around the planet, and that's going to allow people to learn how to discipline their own minds, tame their own anger and aggression, develop peace and happiness internally, and develop compassion for others. And as a result, we will no longer need repressive political systems. Everybody will be able to have democracy, and there'll be pluralism in religion and ethnicity, and we'll have an inclusive planet, and the planet will become a utopia, right? So that's a pretty far-out vision, right? It's very encouraging for us, since we all, but see, in my view, I think we sort of have this now, because, and here's just a beautiful picture of the 3D, the palace of the time machine process. This is kind of what your mind and body would look like if you were looking at it as, from the standpoint of the ecstatic mother-father of your own bliss and embracing, ecstatic altruism or ecstatic openness. I mean, that's just a little poetry. But anyway, if you think about it this way, that, we've got this, religions warring on the planet, right? The major blocks of human cultures are religious blocks, but they can't agree. Some of them have sort of gone awry in various ways in various places. They haven't developed and progressed in the way our sciences have, okay? But they hold this tradition of ethics and compassion, and now that, modern science has rediscovered compassion and rediscovered meditation, there's a bridge possible between our scientific progressive culture and secular culture and these ancient religious cultures that may be a little outmoded but still sort of have the right idea, actually, that we should calm down and be peaceful and kind. And so my view is that in the future, the integration of this is kind of a contemplative science, understanding the importance of spiritual, contemplative, ethical training, and traditions that have the skills for training people in their local environments, whatever they are, like people who were brought up in Islam or people who were brought up in Judaism or Christianity or whatever. They can use their own methods to train compassion. But the contemplative science can give the secular culture and even the religious people who think, well, let's just go on Sunday, a sort of a clearer understanding and motivation of how important it is to really actually practice these things, that it's important to their health, it's important to their happiness. And so in my view, I think we may really be on the cusp of a revolutionary convergence where science and religion can start to work together again, right? And I think this is really most personified by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who has this beautiful wish that I want to leave you with. This is my simple religion. There's no need for temples, no need for complicated philosophy. Our own brain, our own heart is our temple. The philosophy is kindness. So with that, thank you. And for anyone who, I will be happy to take some questions, but if anyone is interested in either our 4-year program, which is the sort of leisurely route through all 3 of those disciplines of contemplative training, or the 2-year program for professionals. Here you need some kind of license as a therapist, a teacher, a social worker, a doctor, an educator. If you're interested in either of those, we have some cards up here. Maybe Annie can hand them out, or just have them by the door or something like that. Yes, Any questions?
Emmy has a mic, so if you have questions, she will bring it to you. And I'm sure people have very good questions, and we'd love to hear.
Where is the Institute?
So the office of the Institute is on 90th Street in Central Park West, but most of our classes are held at Tibet House on 15th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. And so if you visit our website, you'll see we're sort of winding down. We have now, we have a retreat up at Menlong Mountain Retreat in Phoenicia, New York, starting on sustainable happiness. So weekend retreat starting the 10th, if you're looking for some place to get away and look at the tulips. And we'll be having an upcoming benefit and I'll be interviewing Bob Thurman and taking him through his trek on foot across Persia and Afghanistan. And that's on the 5th of June. There'll also be a weekend retreat in New York City on the 17th of, I'm sorry, I think it's the 17th of July, the weekend of the 17th of July. And then there's a whole fall series. And actually one of our Columbia professors, Dr. Pilar Jennings, will be starting a 4-year program in the fall. She teaches at Union Theological. She's very active in the Center for the Study of Science and Religion, and she'll be teaching. We have one teacher follow through all 4 years with students, so it's really kind of a chance to develop a community. That's one of the things that people like about it, and sort of pursue these things together over a 4-year period. It's sort of like a college, for happiness, right? Sort of a. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm intrigued by trauma avoidance, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you were talking about,
Right.
what it is, and how you work with those people.
Great. Okay. So remember I mentioned that there's the two sides of the brain, and that one of them is more sort of into approaching and thinking positive, as it were, feeling positive, and the other is more into worrying about the worst thing that might happen and avoiding danger. Okay? So traumatic avoidance refers to that syndrome that happens when people undergo trauma. So any trauma is anything that's experienced, any event or interaction that's experienced by a person is life-threatening. So it can be a very wide range of things. And what happens is that when you feel your life is threatened, then you get a little bit shell-shocked. Okay, it's like the war veteran who comes home, they hear the door open and they go like that. Or they just want to stay in the house because they go outside, it's just too much. There's too many things that trigger fear. So traumatic avoidance literally refers to when someone is hypervigilant because of having a life-threatening stressor, and they avoid things that might trigger their flashbacks or panics or fears. And that's what women, like I talk to women who, after treatment for breast cancer say, I can't go to the doctor. Every time I think about going to the doctor, I have a panic attack. I'm sitting in the office. I dread it for months. I keep thinking, or if I get a little pimple, I think my cancer is going to recur. So, this happens to people with all kinds of situations. It's not just illness, but it certainly happens with them. And how we work with that really is to help people understand that it's our own minds at that point that are really causing us to suffer. And to try to help to give people the skills to face our own minds. I was just talking to a group of women this morning about this. And to stop worrying about the thing that we're terrified about, especially since in these cases it's really not happening, but to start to worry about the terror, or really engage the terror, and to turn the focus back on the mind and train in skills that allow us to disarm the fear so that our own mind isn't terrorizing us, basically. And that's the first step in bringing peace and happiness into our lives, is really to learn to stop the struggle for survival that we've been in for hundreds of millions of years, right? And especially we as humans, as the most dependent of all mammals, right? We come into the world completely dependent on the love and kindness of others. And there are many, and that's a traumatic experience. I mean, and I believe that even if you had Buddha parents, they could not take the trauma out of childhood because children are very painfully aware of how vulnerable they are. And every time mommy goes to the bathroom and they don't know whether she's coming back, they have a little mini trauma. So we have these mini traumas through our life. That's why we spend time on the couch. But these techniques provide powerful ways of reversing trauma because they allow us to approach the trauma using different parts of our nervous system that are naturally capable of disarming it, right? So we have the equipment within ourselves to heal these things, but if we're living in the problem, we can't heal them, we're only making it worse, right? So, yes?
So my question, thank you for
Okay.
this very interesting presentation. My question is about how to apply what you're talking about into policy. And the reason I come to that question is that right now at the United Nations, the Royal Government of Bhutan is initiating resolutions at the UN and high-level meetings that I've actually been invited to that are about including happiness and well-being in the measurement of development besides GDP. So how can this be applied to government policy, which ultimately is going to make a difference in the way we live?
I think there's a lot of people trying to put their heads to that problem. I know some of the people that worked on their gross national happiness model, and Mark Anilsky and Sandra Cheaterman and so on. And there are people that are trying to develop this new approach toward economics that factor this triple bottom line approach that factors in the human cost and the quality of life. And it's a very thorny, sticky problem, of course, because we're dealing with centuries of entrenched, linear thinking and entrenched objectivism. Like I said, it's Aristotle and physics rule. The mind doesn't matter, and my dear friend Dan Siegel, who's a really terrific developmental psychiatrist, who does a lot of teaching about meditation, neuroplasticity. He just sort of really struck a chord for me when he shared the experience that going through medical school, nobody ever really defines mind. Nobody ever really says that there is a mind. You see, not to mention you barely ever see a person. You see cells, you see molecules, you see organs, you see diseases, but you never see people. So there's no mind, there's no person in our science. Houston Smith, the sort of famous religion scholar, made this case in his book, Why Religion Matters. But the part of the problem is that we've been spending 5 centuries divorcing ethics, contemplation, and these qualitative experiences and realities from science and from economics. And so we're going to have to spend, it's going to take us a little while to get Humpty Dumpty back together again, I think. The value of these ancient cultures is that they haven't done that. And a tradition like this is part of the reason why as soon as I went to, it's a very personal story. My father was a psychiatrist in the heyday of psychoanalysis, and my mother was a teacher, but a history teacher, but she was a very spiritual person. And actually, interestingly enough, she did much better than he did over the years. And I saw this, and I loved what he did. He's a therapist. I wanted to be a psychiatrist, but I didn't want to wind up as stressed out and freaked out and sort of, he got over the years negative. He was a brilliant man, but he just burned out, okay? And so I really wanted to integrate spirituality and science spirituality and psychotherapy from the very beginning. And you know, the moment I got to college and I went to my first religion class and met Bob Thurman with his funny hair and his flower tie, you know, and I started hearing about Tibetan culture, I said, well, here's a culture that really hasn't split these things apart and has sort of a real scientific understanding of the world in some ways, not our high-tech scientific understanding, but also has the psychology, the inner focus on the quality of life, improving the quality of life, and understanding the relationship between mind and body, mind and matter, you know, quality and quantity, and that kind of thing. And so I'm afraid that this is, you know, it's just going to be a gradual process. But, you know, the healthcare curve is going to be pushing us in this direction because just taking care of problems and not taking care of people, you know, fixing things and not teaching anybody anything isn't sustainable. And I think certainly our information overload culture, our global information overload culture, is going to take more and more of our mindfulness and spread it out all over the map. And if we don't start to practice how to have a center in our own minds and bodies and resist all of this, we're going to be, you know, we're going to burn out. So I think that policy-wise, there's a lot of very smart people thinking about how to bring these things together. I think it has to happen. I think it will happen. I don't know when. I mean, I never thought this would happen. I never thought that neuroscience would come to embrace meditation or embrace compassion. You know, I gave up on that, you know, decades ago, and then here it is. So you never know. Maybe a decade or two from now, we'll have the whole world will be following the gross national happiness model, and everybody will be meditating. That's what the Kala Chakra says. It's going to happen. I mean, I would just say another thing about this tradition is that don't feel like a helpless, powerless person. This changing the world one person at a time seems like an inefficient means. But when you understand that that's really all the world is, it's just a bunch of people. I mean, and other life and so on. But I mean, basically, if we're not changing people, we're not really changing anything. And so if you want to be part of the change, then each one of us needs to be buying into some vision of how this is going to be solved, right? How is, you know, quality of life, training in self-awareness and self-care, training in compassion and social and skills, how is that going to be brought into a culture and a curriculum that has been prided itself and built itself entirely around getting those things out of it, right? So, but we have to have a vision, and this is my, you know, wacky vision of that. Yes, in the back there.
It's interesting you're talking about the vagus nerve and how it's stimulated by your voluntary breathing and whatnot. And I was just wondering if there's been some control studies into looking at the results if you have voluntary breathing and are stimulating this nerve versus if you were to stimulate it with some sort of external electrode or something. What have been some of the studies that they're looking into with this vagal nerve stimulation?
Well, I don't know if that particular study has been done, but there's been a fairly large amount. This is a new field. It really is just sort of came on, you know, Stephen Porges has been quietly working on this. Nobody's really even known about it. And he just published his book in 2011, you know. He'd been publishing his papers, but it's really been a well-kept secret. People have, like Kevin Tracy, a colleague of mine at North Shore Hospital, has shown that vagal nerve stimulation electrically is effective for reducing local inflammation. It's really demonstrating sort of what had been a speculative idea for a long time, that the vagal nerve promotes a balance in immunity. It promotes immunity, but it also calms a local hyperimmunity, like cytokine excess or autoimmune disorders. People have certainly studied yogic breathing. There's a whole crop of studies from the TM people, Shanoff, Khalsa, and others, that show that balancing the breath through this method of alternate nostril breathing, you might have learned in yoga class sometime, balances the cerebral hemispheres and balances the activity of the vagal and sympathetic nervous system. But really not enough has been done, honestly. I mean, there's still a ton to do. I think that there's tantalizing bits of evidence. Herb Benson did a few studies in advanced breath meditators. There's some few studies of intensive breath exercises and reducing trauma. But it's clear that these people using advanced breath practices can regulate their primal functions, like some of Benson's studies and some other studies done by a guy named Craig Heller from Stanford. This is way back in this 90s, 80s, 90s, show that people through these practices can reduce their basal metabolism by as much as 65%. So imagine how much longer you could live and how much calmer you would be if basically that amounts to like you're sort of half hibernating while you're going through your day, which might not be a bad idea because hibernation is a very curative process, just like deep sleep. Okay, that's the idea here, is that we have the brains to craft a better default state of consciousness than the one that we have sort of stumbled upon through surviving many eons of struggle, and we now have the science together with all these ancient contemplative skills to really do that, to try to create, to craft the tools to build a state of consciousness or a way of being in the world that really is protective to us and effective for, creating the kind of world we want to live in. So I don't know if we have any other questions. There's one in the back. Yeah.
I was listening to NPR one time, and we were talking about a book that was telling how the Filipinos are the happiest people on earth. And I don't know if you know about the book or why that is, because they're very poor people. I mean, I'm from the Philippines. It's a very, very poor country, and I can't reconcile how they could be that.
Yes. Well, you might want to look at a movie, a documentary that is on Netflix called Happy. And it has Richie Davidson, the little snippets of His Holiness, but it has a lot of people who are basically hardcore happiness researchers talking about what really are what we now really understand what happiness is made of. And, some sort of a sobering percent of it, 40 or 50%, is biological. Although, frankly, from my point of view, given neuroplasticity, I don't believe that. I believe that that's maybe twin studies. There may be better temperaments and not such good temperaments, but I think you can cook up your own temperament. And I think that people, certainly Richie Davidson believes that, and a lot of contemporary neuroscientists. And there's a lot of research evidence to say that we could become happier people regardless of what our temperament is. But I'll leave that aside for the time being. But what they say is that the external sources of happiness that most people focus on, especially in this culture, as the dominant things that are going to give us happiness, stuff, fame, celebrity, that kind of thing, only accounts for 10% of happiness. So we're wasting 90% of our time and energy on 10%. And that actually the 40% is what they call intrinsic sources of happiness. That is sources of happiness that I guess you'd have to say are natural, intrinsic to the way our minds and bodies work. And that is mostly simple natural rhythms of life, strong positive relationships, community. Okay? Those things, that old sort of religious values, they work. And there's a number of different communities where they contrast the Japanese community on Okinawa with the mainland Japanese community, and there's a very interesting contrast because the same genetics, but two completely different cultures, and they're completely different on the happiness spectrum, and they're also completely different on the longevity spectrum. Okinawa is known as the longevity capital of the world. And they have a very simple life, very simple. But they have a lot of community, and they take a lot of joy in sharing their lives.